Good morning. Thanks to all of you. Thanks especially to those who have helped bring Antonio and me here and introduce us to this place we've heard so much about from the students who visited us in Italy. It's very moving to me to finally be here. Just give me a minute. And to see also returning students, which is for anyone who teaches the biggest treat, to think that there's a kind of continuity. And to see readers as well as writers in the room, because we're all one family. And this is a remarkable school, so I don't probably have to tell most of you that, but it really is quite a special place. And great gratitude to all of you for making it possible for us to visit. And Leah's going to help me with the word that is the subject of my talk, because Danish is beautiful and impossible. So I appreciate your generosity in letting me speak in English. And Leah, what is my talk about? Got that? Coincidence. Coincidence, yes. And I wanted to talk about this in part because of how I met Simon Fruland 9 years ago at a literary conference in the States, in Minneapolis, quite by chance. I was sitting at a table of a literary and human rights organization trying to pull people in, and a nice man walked by, and I said, "You, come over here. Let me talk to you about what's happening at the organization that I was assisting then." And he told me he was Danish, and one thing led to another, and here I am. Just like that, a literary friendship, a collegial friendship turned into a community. And that's what this is all about, and that's why it's so important. So what exactly is a coincidence? Well, at the dictionary definition level, it's a simultaneous occurrence of events with no apparent causal connection, yet which seem related somehow, and therefore the relation becomes meaningful to us. Now, lots of coincidences go unnoticed, of course, but it's when we notice, when we pay attention, that a coincidence starts to kind of shine with meaning, even if it's a meaning that the coincidence doesn't actually deserve. That's what's sort of strange about coincidences. They're really both common and surprising. There's a famous and wonderful Argentinian writer, some of you may know, Julio Cortázar, who points out, and this is a quote from him, that coincidence acts as a lightning rod. That's one of those metal poles you put on your house to pull the lightning in and deflect it so that it doesn't burn your house down. So attention acts as a kind of lightning rod, and merely by concentrating on something, paying attention to it, says Cortázar, you can kind of cause endless analogies to collect around it, and that is the experience that we call coincidence. As I was preparing for this talk, I came across the observations of an author I'd not heard of named Bernard Beitman, who named for me 3 kinds of coincidence. The first is environment. So for instance, I'm at a table at a literary conference, and a Danish man walks by that table, and we meet. The environment brought us there, and that's type 1. The second type is mind environment, as when, and I'm sure this has happened to all of you, I think of someone and then they suddenly show up at my door. You all know that, right? That sort of strange sense of, you were just in my mind. And the third type is mind, as when I sense that someone is in pain or trouble, but they're at a distance, and then I learn the next day that they were in pain or trouble in that moment. But of course, I had no way of knowing that. So it's that third kind is sort of the strangest, isn't it? Mind. We're creatures, we're human beings who like finding or thinking we find patterns of significance, of meaning. Noticing patterns actually comes very naturally to us. I mean, you all know, watching a baby, they like to find the red and blue block and put it with the red and blue block. That's a thing that kids learn early on, square with square, round with round. We like seeking and finding patterns. And we do the same thing with events. And often without realizing it, we look for patterns in events that are going to confirm what turn out to be pre-existing beliefs or assumptions about the world. So for instance, if we're the kind of person who think the universe is entirely random in its running, or if we think it operates according to a real but hidden design that gives it some sort of coherence, that's going to change how we actually feel about coincidences. Some people give them a lot of value, and other people think they're of no value, little or no value. They're just random stuff. Apart from considerations that can get existential like that, what is the universe patterned in meaningful little ways or not, apart from all that, I would say that one thing coincidences definitely do is help our imaginations stay active. They return us to childhood, in fact, to the great questions kids often ask. What if? Why not? We don't have easy explanations for them. They're mysterious and puzzling. They're also rebellious because, in essence, every coincidence is breaking some sort of rule about what is supposed to happen when. And if we're not really skeptical about coincidences, they actually can and do give us a lot of pleasure. And even a skeptic can't deny that just about all of our life stories include at least a few coincidences. I think it'll be hard to find someone who'd never experienced a coincidence in their life. So speaking about life stories, speaking about fiction, this being a literary festival, what about the use of coincidences in short stories and novels, and for that matter, poems, plays, personal essays? Should a writer consider coincidences a helpful tool or a cheap trick? One thing is certain. Readers don't like it when coincidences make things too simple or easy in a story, like when the police car just happens to drive by right when the crime is being committed. That kind of thing feels too easy to us. It uncomplicates a situation we imagine is more complicated and much more interesting than it is if a coincidence is all that's needed to resolve it. So a writer definitely needs to avoid using coincidences in ways that are reductive and oversimplifying. There's an American writer I know, who's also a friend, named Alice Madison, and she has some really useful guidance for writers on how to use coincidences in stories or novels. One way, she says, is to have the coincidence occur but not solve any problem. That is, the coincidence is a point of interest, of intrigue, but it's not something on which the entire plot depends. And it certainly is not going to provide any kind of quick resolution for what's happening in the work of fiction. Another way to use a coincidence is to start a story with one. So the reason for the stories being told is the coincidence, but the coincidence itself isn't the entire story. It's just the kickoff. This summer I read The Fall of the King. Show of hands, how many of you have read The Fall of the King? Great Danish novel. Yeah. And it starts with a coincidence because the main character, the main protagonist, Mikael, is he pronounced, actually sees the king. He sees him from afar in the town that they are both in. But it isn't until much later that he and the king's lives become very entwined. So the coincidence of them actually meeting, at least visually, occurs early on. But it isn't important for quite some time. That's the thing that Alice Madison is talking about here as one way to use coincidence. Another way is to introduce a coincidence that the reader perceives, but not all the characters are aware of. So imagine, say, a woman shows up at a restaurant where a wedding reception is happening. The bride and the groom are circulating among their guests, greeting them, and the bride notices a woman coming into the restaurant, but she doesn't know who this woman is. It's actually the groom's first wife. Why doesn't she realize? Well, because the groom never actually mentioned he was previously married. So, before long, the bride notices that some of the guests are kind of looking at this unfamiliar woman, And also the groom himself seems to be surprised when he sees this woman, and the strange woman herself seems startled by seeing the husband. Now, so how does this scene work to kind of grab our attention, to be that kind of lightning rod? Well, it keeps us engaged not because the bride is fixed upon the coincidence of the former wife showing up at the restaurant where the wedding reception just happens to be taking place, because the bride doesn't perceive the coincidence. We do, though, and we can tell that it's going to cause trouble. We can see that the bride senses that something in her husband's past has been hidden from her, but she doesn't yet know what it is. And the scene makes us curious. Will she discover her new husband's secret? And then what will happen? So the coincidence functions for us, but not for her. There's yet another way of using coincidence, yet another, which is to let the reader know that the fictional world that the author's giving you is unusual in certain ways, that it doesn't follow the normal rules of reality. So maybe, say, a red snake comes out of a water faucet just as someone puts a red jar of paint in the sink after painting the wall red. Red snake coming out of faucet with red paint. Something like that is like a little flag waving at the reader saying, stuff isn't adding up here. Something's weird going on. And this kind of use of coincidence, you find more often in speculative or non-realistic fiction as a useful way to sort of flag for you, pay attention now. You also have to keep in mind, though, as a writer, about what I call the outside-inside challenge. It's a larger question. A good story offers the reader a full, complex set of characters to spend time with and to enjoy, because those characters aren't merely stereotypes. They're fully rounded, rich people that we recognize as individuals. To create such characters and make the reader care about them, the writer has to do something different from offering explanations or analyses of their thoughts and feelings. A good story needs actions and events outside the characters, in the fictional world, outside them. And those outside events and actions cast light on the inside things, on the characters' inner motivations, fears, desires, needs. Now, where does coincidence fit into this outside-inside challenge? Well, a coincidence is a concurrence, that is, the happening of two things the reader might not expect to exist or happen at the same time. This concurrence or simultaneity hints at some reality that is fascinating and just out of reach, some mystery that our rational selves can't account for. We can dismiss that mystery, of course. We can just say, some random thing. But our lives are, in fact, filled with coincidences, and our lives are filled with mysteries as well, things that aren't visible right away, that take time to reveal themselves, and that even when revealed may not actually be clear to us. Well, thank God for that, right? I mean, how dull would our experience be if it was always clear? Coincidences are a kind of friendly reminder of the role of mystery in our lives, and they're also a means of practicing how we might best approach mystery itself. Do we approach it with fear and trepidation, or with curiosity and openness? As Alice Madison points out, writers always run the risk of offering the reader a coincidence that's just too obvious, as when the police car, or as when a story opens with one event and then another is introduced that happens at the same time, just happens to. Now, there's a chance, though, that some sort of useful tension can be generated between those two events. In fact, generating that tension may be what a writer needs to do when she's drafting a story and isn't sure where it's going. Probably happened to some of you writing in the room? Not sure where it's going? Show of hands? Yes. Okay. When we put two events and actions together at the same time, both of them credible, but their relation odd, inexplicable, then we're giving fiction a chance to spark meaning, like rubbing two stones, and a spark comes out. And that meaning, as Alice Madison says, may lie just beyond the surface of the story. Now, of course, a skeptical reader can say that meaning beyond the just beyond the surface isn't valid. There's no objectively verifiable pattern here. But what's important, I think, isn't whether we interpret a coincidence rightly or wrongly, or whether its meaning can somehow be proved. What's important is that the coincidence stirs our imagination, which in turn stirs our curiosity, and ultimately our empathy. That is, our ability to connect with another person's experience, no matter how different from our own. Personally, I feel that a big part of why we like to read good literature is for the pleasure of sensing that something important, something meaningful, does indeed lie just outside our grasp, and we have to do a bit of work to get at it. Perhaps the real gift of coincidences is the practice they give us in stretching beyond predictable or obvious conclusions. Today, many forces conspire to make us shut down our imaginations and fall in line with standard or majoritarian notions about politics, about culture, about our future on the planet. I needn't tell you where an unthinking or automatic devotion to certain explanations and conclusions can lead people to violence and war, to fascism, to hatred of any and all others. Now more than ever, each of us needs a flexible and robust imagination so we can push against the kind of mental and emotional laziness that leads us to say, oh, sure, if you say so, of course, that's how it must be. We must reinforce that instinct within us to ask questions about appearance versus reality, about how things seem to be versus what actually might be going on, even if it's not immediately visible. Coincidences aren't truths, and they shouldn't be held up as such, but they can be helpful in getting us to be curious about our own and other people's experiences, and can help us take ourselves, our opinions, our certainties a little less seriously, to open ourselves to revision, just as our stories are open to revision. I'm going to end with one little tale for you to ponder. In the Dolomite Mountains in Italy, a large dam called Vallon broke in 1962, killing just about everyone in a small village just below the dam. Hundreds of bodies were buried in mud and debris, never to be found. A woman named Michele Colletti, who was a child at the time of the disaster, was thrown out of her bed and house. She landed on the ground several hundred meters away and was rescued by the only remaining firemen of the village. In fact, those two were among the only survivors of the tragedy altogether. Michele's mother, sister, and grandmother, her father's mother, were all in the house with her, and they all died. In an interview about what happened on that October evening, Michele recounted that shortly before the dam broke, her father returned home from work and then got back in his car and left almost immediately. That was unusual for him, Michele said. He'd never done that before. She never saw him again. Now, what I've told you is an example of a story starting with a coincidence. On the same night as the Vallon disaster, a man comes home from work and then immediately leaves and is never seen again by his daughter. So there's one obvious question we can ask here. Would the father have lived if he'd stayed at home, like Michele lived, or would he have died along with his wife, his other daughter, and his mother? But there is another question to ask, one that attracts me as a storyteller. Where was the father headed when he left? You could write quite a story about where he went after he left home and what actually happened to him. Presumably, he died in the disaster, but what if, like Michele, he didn't die? Presumably, he had a reason for coming home and then leaving right away, but what was the reason? Perhaps someone else in the family, his wife or his mother, knew where he was going, but what if they had no idea because he told absolutely no one beforehand? No doubt his only surviving daughter, Michele, had thoughts afterward about where her father went and why. But what kind of thoughts? So I'm going to leave you now with the start of a story in your heads. A story opening with a coincidence, but extending well beyond it. And maybe one of you will write that story. And if you do, I'd like to read it. Thank you so very much.